Are you a seasoned security leader working to build your security program and gain executive support? Or are you a new security manager growing and getting the most out of your team? Maybe you came from a deeply technical role or a non-security role altogether and are looking for tips, tricks, and best practices to solve your day-to-day security leadership and management challenges. If any of that sounds familiar, join us at the annual SAN Cybersecurity Leadership Summit on Thursday, May 25th to hear what's worked and what hasn't worked for industry leaders, CISOs, directors, managers, and leaders. Learn more and register for this free and online summit at www.sans.org/summits. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to Seat at the Table. Sorry, thought I was muted for a second. My apologies, guys. Yeah, welcome to Seat at the Table, where we believe your technical skills will get you in the room, but your soft skills and business acumen will earn you a seat. My name is Jerich Beason, and I'm the host. Every time we have one of these conversations, we're speaking with leaders across different verticals, different industries that have different roles. And we really just dive into topics that are going to help prepare and equip the next generation of cybersecurity leaders by extracting some of those hard-earned lessons from the years of experience each of our guests bring with them. Today, we're going to talk about aligning cybersecurity across the enterprise. Now, we all hear the phrase that cyber should be enablers of the business. And though I wholeheartedly agree with that, it's kind of a cliche at this point. So I'm excited to dig into what this actually looks like in a real organization, in a practical sense. And I think I might actually have the perfect guest for this conversation. We met a few weeks ago at the RSA conference, and he presented on this topic in the CISO bootcamp. And I knew I wanted to continue this conversation with all of you guys coming along for the journey. So without further ado, our guest is Omar Kawaja. Omar, welcome to the show.
Absolutely. Welcome. Thank you for having me, Jerich. I'm super excited to be here.
Right on, man. Right on. Well, please share a little bit about yourself, your role, what you've done in your past. The audience wants to hear.
Yeah, Jerich, in my current role, I am I'm the field CISO at a company called Databricks, which is probably the largest data and AI platform. So many of the organizations that you hear about that work on data and AI, there's a good chance that the underlying platform that they're running their machine learning and AI workloads on is Databricks. I've only been in this role a few months, but prior to this, I worked for a company called Highmark Health. I was the CISO there for about 9 years and sort of went through maybe about 3 or 4 different transformations. And every 2 to 3 years, I was like, I feel like I've accomplished a lot and maybe it's time to leave. And I would look back and realize, you know what, I don't really quite feel good about the state I've left this program in, and there's still more work to be done. And I would have another go at it and have another step function improvement in the program, which would likely take another 2 to 3 years. And I did that a few times until I finally got to a point where it felt like the organization was in a good place, and it was time to try something else. In addition to that, I've some of the activities I really feel privileged to participate in, and the roles that I really feel privileged to be in, are that I sit on the board of the FAIR Institute, which is all about promoting risk quantification. I sit on the board of High Trust, which is all about simplifying how organizations get to have effective controls and get to hold their third parties accountable and do so in an efficient and effective manner when it comes to security and compliance. And then lastly, I have the honor of teaching at Carnegie Mellon's CISO program, and I've gotten to do that for the last 7 or 8 years. So I'm super fortunate in that I get to be around lots and lots of CISOs through the different roles that I have, and I get to learn from all of them and continue to get ideas for how I can be a little bit better.
First, thank you for joining, and I like that you're kind of acknowledging the fact that you're exposed to so many other CISOs, and that just makes you better. There's kind of another reason why I do this show. I get an opportunity to speak with CISOs like yourself and others, and I'm a lot better as a result of it. And I know that this is going to be a really good conversation. So let's just kind of hop right on in.
Yeah.
So kind of like I was saying earlier, cyber in aligning with the business, it's something we're always talking about, but it's easier said than done. Right. So what are some of the challenges that you faced through your different evolutions, when it came to achieving alignment into, with the rest of the enterprise, and how'd you overcome them?
Yeah. Great question, Jerich. I feel like I've made more mistakes as a CISO than probably any other CISO that I know. So I've made lots and lots of mistakes. So for instance, I thought when I joined the organization, I thought, you know what, there's a whole lot of stuff that's missing, and almost all of the stuff was either represented by a 3-letter acronym or by a 4-letter acronym. And it just seemed really, really obvious. My job was to fill the void of all of those 3 and 4-letter acronyms. And when those voids were filled, my job would be done. I'd give myself an A+ and I'd move on. And so I got EDR and I got DLP and I got SIM and I got DEM and I did all of those things. And I thought it would feel really good when I was done, and it didn't. And so then I thought, I've got to go figure out how to get the best team, because I didn't feel like I had the strongest team that was working really well together. And I worked on creating a better team and a better program and org structure. And when that was done, I thought I'd walk in, the following month after that was done. And I felt like I had the right leaders and the right critical roles were all staffed with A players. And I thought then surely I'd feel like I'm all done. And it still wasn't done. I was like, okay, maybe I need to fix processes. And I was like, okay, let me go fix processes. And as soon as I fix these processes and go get some third-party certifications, then, I'll be able to show the world, and I'll be able to tell my board, look, we've got all these amazing certifications. And now I should feel like, I've summited the peak of CISO-dom. And I still didn't feel like I was done, but I did feel a little dumb for making a lot of mistakes to get there. And I was like, you know what? I'm not really including the business in the conversation. I feel like I'm subjecting the business to security, but I'm not doing it with them. I'm not necessarily partnering with them. And as I started to have conversations with the business, it started to feel a whole lot better. And there's a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, which I wish someone had shared with me earlier in my CISO career, because it sort of has been maybe one of the guiding quotes for me. And it's probably the simplest way of delineating between security and risk management. And the quote goes, "If the job of a ship's captain was to keep it from sinking, he would never leave harbor." And the moment I started paying attention to that and thinking of that seriously, I realized my job is not to be the smartest security person. My job is to be the smartest cyber risk leader in the organization, which means it's got to look at all the bad that can happen, which security can help prevent. And it's got to look at all the good that can happen that the business is super excited about. And my job is to sort of be a bridge dweller in between those to help illuminate conversations on both sides and come up with something that makes sense. But all the while realizing that I'm there kind of like the ship's captain. I'm there to serve the business. And one of the things that I found several times in my own career, and I see security leaders regularly get very frustrated, is they're like, the business doesn't care. And they're trying to convince the business to do something. And my view is, there's one of two things likely happening. Either we're not communicating to the business in a way that they understand using their words. And if that's not happening, then we just need to use the right words and use the terms and use the principles and the consequences and the trade-offs that really matter to the business, which means no vendor names, which means no technology names, which means no acronyms, because none of those exist in business land. And if once we get the language right and we've sufficiently and confidently explained to the business what the situation is, if they still don't care, then we should respect that position, because ultimately we're here to serve the business. And sometimes I feel like what we do is the equivalent of if we worked at a physical security company like ADT, and we had a customer that was adamant that they wanted to leave the back door ajar, we wouldn't go to the customer and say, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? We would say, this is your house. We understand that you've got some of your own reasons why you would like to leave your back door ajar all night. And if that's what you really want to do, then you go for it. We want to make sure you understand the risks associated with it, but ultimately it's your house. You get to make these decisions.
So first you end this thing with a metaphor. So I cannot not acknowledge that metaphor and analogy. That is beautiful. I am going to use it, and it's going to get to a point where I'm going to say they want to leave the back door open. That's on them. Like, I think we're going to say it so often that my team's just gonna understand that. But you said so much, and I want to try to unpack little pieces and parts of it. But I want to start with the quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. If you ask a cybersecurity person, a leader, executive, a CISO, what the role of cyber is, everybody has a different definition. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or to enable the business, or all these things that people say, and no one ever can land on the same thing. My definition is extremely short, but I think it encompasses what you say. We enable the business to take risk. Everything that they want to do online, it's a risk because it's online. If it's connected to a blue wire or connected to one of the IEEE communication standards, that is a risk. And everything that we do is enabling them to take that specific risk. And if we keep that in mind, it's a lot easier to proceed.
Yeah, but you're exactly right. Like I once was in a leadership class, and they said something to the effect that businesses wouldn't exist if they didn't take risks.
Right.
Like, if you exist as a business, you are almost by definition going to take risks. So if we tell the business they can't take risks, they would likely politely say to us, you kind of don't understand what we do here, and maybe you're not a good fit. So what makes our job hard is helping the business figure out how to take those risks and to do them as safely as possible. But if you do that well, at some point the business will say that risk is not worth taking. So for instance, I've had conversations where the business has said, Omar, can you tell us at what point we should disconnect our systems from the internet? That's not something I said to them. I sort of explained to them what's going on, but I would never go to the business and say, we think we should disconnect from the internet. But if I do a really, really good job explaining things to them in terms they understand, then they're going to come up with the obvious responses that sometimes are going to make sense.
Precisely. I love that as well. And you were going down the list of the mistakes that you made. And you're like, oh, we bought all the tools, got all the acronyms, put all the blinky lights in. And then you're like, wait, I don't really have good people. So then you started bringing in the people. And I said to myself, if he says he does not have good processes next, I'm going to try my best to keep a straight face. And it sounds like, which is impressive, you were able to convince the business to give you the money to do these things without A, aligning with the business first, and B, without having good people to put these things in place and having no processes to actually make these tools and make these people effective, which you're right. You probably have made more mistakes than the average CISO, and I don't know how you survived during that. I'm curious to know, what was the duration of these evolutions? So, to bring in a tool and technology, it takes time to find the right tool, like, evaluate and do the POCs, and then it's even more time to put in the tool. I'm curious, on average, what was the duration for each one of these evolutions?
Yeah, probably about 2 to 3 years. And the way that it worked is I had it overlapped. So as one evolution was sort of getting close to the end, and I was like, okay, what do I do next? Because I feel like something isn't working well, and there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I would start the next. So overall, these evolutions ended up taking 9 years. And one of the reasons I said that I've made more mistakes than any other CISO, because I just followed the wrong sequence. So I started with tech, I then went to people, I then went to process, and then finally I was like, oh, maybe I should focus on some outcomes that the business cares about, right? Which is not the right sequence to go in at all. But that's kind of what I did, and it took me, you know, I'd say one of the reasons I didn't want to stop being a CISO in the organization that I was at right before Databricks is because I wanted to get to the point where I was like, I think I finally get it. I understand it. I've seen the full cycle of where I need to end up, and I feel pretty good about where I am. Is the program perfect? Absolutely not. But do I feel like I now know what to focus on and what the most important things are and to give them their due level of importance? Yeah, I definitely got there.
Okay. All right. And so while you're trying to get this alignment, the average leader, CISO, knows that a strong security culture is paramount when you're trying to get alignment. And you waited until later on to work towards alignment. So I'm curious, in your opinion, what are some of the more critical elements of building a security culture? And how can organizations ensure that, their employees and their leaders are really invested in cybersecurity?
Yeah, and when it comes to alignment, there's alignment that you need to get at that executive level, and early on, I sort of had that alignment at the executive level where the people were bought into the program, is why they gave me all the funding I needed in order to go deploy the technology. So I built the relationships with the people, but it wasn't necessarily based on here's sort of the clear business outcomes that early on. It was where I got lucky, where a bunch of healthcare organizations were happening to get breached, and there was a clear understanding that, you know what, we've got to make sure we're investing in cyber because everyone else is as well. So the reason we got the funding and I was able to implement the technology was not because of what I did, but it was almost in spite of what I did. I just happened to be operating in an environment and a climate where I had the wind in my sails, and I absolutely took advantage of it. Now, later on, I finally got to, hey, I've got to build strong alignment with the business because you can operate a program where the value proposition is we don't want to end up in the headlines, and that works for 2-3 years. But after that really, really stops working because you end up at some point the business looks at you and says, why can't you operate like the rest of the disciplines and the departments across the organization? None of them keep saying to us, the sky's falling. So how do you mature up, and how do you use metrics, and how do you align, and how do you be strategic, and how do we have conversations that don't seem like they're scary and full of FUD every time? And I'd sort of come to this, Jerich, maybe my third year into it. I left a board meeting, and one of the board members said at the end of the meeting, Omar, I enjoy your conversations, and every time you're done, I always am left really scared. And I was like, that really makes me feel icky. Like, that was not a good feeling to hear that. On the one hand, I could be like, well, they heard me and I scared them, so now that means they'll listen to whatever I said. It just didn't make me feel good. It probably took me an entire year to figure out why it didn't make me feel good and what reaction I would want. And so then I would start to say to board members, I don't want you to feel scared. I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to feel like, yes, there is some concern, and that concern is being adequately managed, because they're the board, I am management. My job is to manage this risk. And if they feel scared after they're done with my presentation, then that means they don't really have confidence that I'm doing a good job. So, stuff like that. And then getting to the point where you've got that alignment with the business, and alignment with IT is absolutely important. I think these days, the other area that alignment is almost critical and will get even more important in the future is going to be alignment with the data team. So in the past, it was be best friends with IT, be best friends with audit, maybe be best friends with privacy, depending on the nature of the organization. Those were the best friendships that CISOs looked for. I think very quickly, the chief data officer has to be in the top 5 best friends of a CISO in order to be successful. I think as I think about like the challenges and how I overcame them, it was really focusing on what do each of those constituents care about, and can I get the ownership right? So for instance, when I would go to the IT team, it would feel like they were patching the systems and they were updating configurations and they were aligning to disastigs and doing all of those things because they were trying to please me and they were trying to please the security program. And I was like, that doesn't make sense because these aren't my systems. I don't own these technology assets, whether it be an application, it be a laptop, it be a server, it be a container. I don't own any of those. The IT team owns all of those and is responsible for delivering business processes that are built on those technology assets that the IT team owns. And so just getting the pronouns right to say, let's be clear, this is your application, this is your platform, this is your server. We're helping you understand what sort of the risks are, what the expectations are, and where you are against them. And then we were very clear when they would do a good job, we wouldn't say security did a good job. We would call that out and said, application team Y did a good job, business unit X did a good job because they are taking care of their stuff by making it more secure so there's less of a chance that there's disruption to the larger business process they're delivering to their internal and external stakeholders.
Yeah, the transfer of ownership of cybersecurity risk management, right? I tell people all the time, headline shows X, Y, and Z company had all these vulnerabilities, CISO gets raked over the coals. I will say it until I'm blue in the face. CISOs, majority of security teams, they don't patch. like they don't patch. All they can do is bring their hands. They can provide the reports. They can help people along the way. But security teams don't patch. But at the same time, security teams are the ones that are accountable in the public, domain. So let's get to like the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah.
You're going to shift a paradigm in the way that they have seen technology and cybersecurity. It was always cybersecurity is over here, technology is over here, business is over here. And you were trying to kind of meld it all together. What were those initial conversations like when you were trying to get the technology teams, engineering teams to understand, hey, these are your applications, these are your vulnerabilities. I'm here to govern, I'm here to assist. But ultimately, it is your responsibility and you're going to be the back that gets pat, or you're going to be, the one that has your kind of arms wrung at you.
Yeah. They were sort of conversations that in the room, when I would be in the room, everyone would be nodding north and south. And we would leave the room saying that felt really good. Like we talked about it. We explained to them why it was super important. We explained to them what happens if this doesn't happen. And my counterpart on the other side would say, yeah, this is good. This is important. We're going to get it done. Come back 3 months, hardly any progress. Come back 6 months, hardly any progress. And so I built this model that I call the control value continuum. And it says something like the moment you have an idea, like an idea that says we should patch, there's zero value the moment you have that idea, right? Just because you have this idea that patching is amazing doesn't mean that you've actually reduced any risk in your enterprise. Well, then you take that idea and maybe you turn it into some kind of guidance. Maybe it's a policy, maybe it's a standard. At that point, it still has exactly zero value because you've written down this policy or standard and you've put it on some intranet site that nobody goes to every week saying, I wonder what's new. Let me go pay attention to what I need to go do now. Nobody does that, right? And that's just the reality of the world we live in. We wish it wasn't that case, but that's the world we live in. You then say, oh, maybe we should tell people about this idea that we memorialized into a standard or into a policy, and we should tell people about it. So the moment you communicate it, maybe it's a email, maybe it's a training, that's the first time you get a little bit of value. But at this point, the value is marginal. It's non-zero, but it's pretty darn close to being zero. The next thing you need to do is you need to monitor compliance to, and maybe compliance is a bad word for a lot of security people, but lowercase c compliance, or adherence to whatever that standard or policy says. So the moment people know you're watching, the expectation, the likelihood of someone doing something about it goes a little bit higher. And then if you really want to get to the next level, you've got to go report it. So just because I know isn't good enough. But the moment I say, this is the level of adherence, it's 60% here, 80% here, 90% here, we said it needed to be by this date, and 6 months later, this is what it is. The moment you do that, all of a sudden, the adherence to that goes through the roof. And the ultimate thing is to have some kind of a consequence. What is the consequence beyond just reporting of non-adherence to that? And then the final step in that control value continuum is something that I stole from the Japanese, what they call pokayoke, which is mistake proof. How do you prevent someone from not adhering to what you want them to do? So the default is they have to adhere to it. It requires an exception, and it requires an immense amount of friction for someone to not do the thing you don't want them to do. And so I know, Jerich, you love analogies and metaphors. So imagine if someone had this brilliant idea that, we've realized there's some correlation between the speed at which people are going and the number of fatalities on roads. So maybe we should get people to drive slower and less people will die on the highway. Okay, we have an idea that people should drive slower and less people will die. The moment you have that idea, the number of people dying on the highway is exactly the same. The moment there's some kind of a law that's passed in a jurisdiction that says, we're going to now apply this speed limit on this piece of highway, the number of deaths and that highway is still exactly the same. The moment you put up a sign that says, here's the new speed limit, there's a little bit of a few people that start to drive slower, but not a whole lot. The next step is you put a sign up that says, hey, this is the speed limit. And oh, by the way, this is how fast you're driving. Oh, wait, they know that I'm going 10 miles per hour faster than the speed limit. Okay, that's kind of shameful. Let me slow down. That's great. But for some people, that's still not enough. The moment they see that there's cops stopping people on the road, then for some people, they will stop even more. Then for some, they'll have to get a ticket, which will be the consequence for them to say, oh, I should really stop doing this. And then in other cases, you actually start to put barriers in place to physically prevent someone from going faster than you want them to do. And that's the way it works in the real world. And it turns out what it takes, all of those levels to get us to do something as simple as, can you please slow down, is sort of the same mindset, because it's all the same humans that you need to apply to get people to do the things you want them to do from a cyber perspective.
Not only do I love that analogy, I have a visceral response to it because I'm the person that needs 2 tickets and at risk of losing my license before I start to slow down. But you're right. I mean, this was a master class in why metrics matter.
Yeah.
And why they say you can't improve what you don't measure, but you've taken it to the next step. Measuring it doesn't matter if there are no consequences. A mentor of mine would always say, boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. And I think your metrics have SLAs, they have targets, and those are the boundaries. And if there are no consequences, then no one is incentivized to actually follow them.
And like the idea is that when you've got to show up with compassion. So when I sit down with my technology counterparts, I'm showing up as, I desperately want you to look good. Like, I get zero energy, I get zero satisfaction, no dopamine from when I see reds on your chart. Like, I get excited when I see green and blue on your chart, because that to me means you are doing a good job, and I desperately want you to be successful. And so I want to be seen as, I am your cheerleader, I am your supporter, you need help. Let me see how I can take some of the really smart people on my team. Let me go find out what other organizations are doing, because I desperately want you to be super successful. And so in doing so, when I've had technology leaders that have said, Omar, why are you holding me to this metric? There's nothing I can do about this. I've looked at that in some cases and I've said, you know what, you're right. This feels unfair. This feels like we're being mean to you because we're the security team and we can be mean to you and we can be punitive. And so in those cases, we'll take those metrics off the dashboard because we want people to be convinced that we're setting them up for success. We're only going to measure them on the things that they truly have control over, so that the scope has to be very defined. So at Highmark, for instance, we had 14 different business units, each with their own technology platforms. And so each of those business units and the tech leaders associated with it, they got their own, what we called secure index. And one of the platforms was really large. It had a few hundred applications. The leaders came and said, Omar, this is really large. Would you mind maybe creating a secure index for each of the subcomponents of this broader platform so the accountability is clear? That was music to my ears, because that's them saying, we want to look good. We want to take ownership. Can you please help us do this? Absolutely. That is what we're trying to do. We're not your enemy. We're here to help you. And we want you to look good, because when you look good, your platform is successful and is secure and everyone wins.
So this is perfect for aligning with what I'm gonna call business as usual risks, or the things that are kind of day to day. But we've all had that ROI conversation when it comes to major investments in resources, and the majority, like we said, of what security needs to accomplish, others need to help and others need to play a role in. And I know you've experienced the deprioritization of a project. We've all experienced it. And we've also dealt with the competing priority dilemma. And somebody out there is thinking, I just heard that. I just heard that I have competing priorities and security was a little bit lower than, making a customer happy or whatever it may be. How can cyber leaders help organizations balance competing priorities and their different diverse stakeholders when it comes to cybersecurity? And what advice would you give someone, specifically an executive that's looking to navigate these challenges?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of positive psychology, and one of the studies I read many years ago boiled a lot of positive psychology down to 4 words. So whatever you're going to say to anyone, this could be your partner, this could be, it works on my 3-year-old and it works on the CIO. That's sort of the range of this tip. Whatever you're going to say, at the end of it, just append, if you want to. Right? Because we all like agency, we all like control. And when you tell me what to do, you've just given me a reason not to do it because you said so. But the moment you say, Omar, I've seen other people do this, and if you want to, you could do it. Yeah, okay. You know what? I think that's a good idea and I want to do it. And I decided, so yeah, I am going to go do this because of me, not because of you. Right? So like setting sort of your ego aside and helping people make the right decision and doing it with sort of the right outcome in mind becomes really, really important. Setting people up for success, making it abundantly clear that you are aligned on the North Star. So if you're working with the business, the key is, as a security person, you should, I think of 2 very different hats. I've got a security hat and I've got a risk management hat. Security hat is binary. Is there a security concern? Yes or no? And a security person thinks there is something that bad that can happen, therefore we should prevent it. There's no logic in between that says, is it worth preventing? It's something bad will happen, that bad thing needs to be stopped, period. That's the logic. A risk person says, what's the bad stuff that can happen? Business, can you tell me all the good stuff you're excited about? Let me throw both of those into an equation. Maybe I do something really simple and just look at them sort of logically in my head, or I can do something sophisticated and leverage a framework like FAIR, Factor Analysis for Information Risk. And I say, here's the benefits, here's the potential downsides. Is it worth protecting? And for me as the CISO to go to the business with that objective calculation, which means if I always show up and say more security is the answer, I'm going to be ignored. But if I show up and when the situation warrants it, I actually say things like, you know what, this isn't the most secure way of doing it. We would like, the security guy in me is getting hives right now thinking that this isn't going to be patched. We're going to use an outdated system. But you know what? I understand the dire business outcome and the urgency of what you're trying to do. And I think this is a risk worth taking, right? Those are words that as CISOs, we've got to get very comfortable saying. And I think almost every single CISO I know got to do this right when COVID happened, right? So the things that we did for remote access, the things that we did particularly for those of us that were in healthcare, and the way that we deployed applications and brought on systems and brought on third parties, we had to suspend a lot of our regular processes. Why? Because it seemed pretty clear, like if we don't get this right and do it quickly, there will be more people that end up in our hospitals, which are already inundated, and there will be more people that die, and there'll be more people that have long-term consequences. And so it's really obvious that the business imperative and outcome was up here, and the security risk was down here. And so if we leverage that muscle and keep that going to say, how do we be phenomenal risk managers, and how do we get used to saying things like, we understand that security is a lower priority in this case because you want to spend more on X or Y or Z because that gets us closer to the business outcome. So then when you come back and say at some point, hey, this is pretty dangerous, I would not recommend doing this, the executive team looks at you and says, you know, if it was an okay risk to take, Omar would have said that.
Yeah, you're talking about credibility, right? Credibility and trust in what you're having to say. And that is not something you earn on day one. That is something you earn through yeses when they should be yeses and nos never existing, always having some level of grading in between. I love that response as well. I think that we far too often think that we are the center of the universe.
Yes.
And we are keenly aware of all the possible bad things that can happen. So naturally, we are trying to mitigate all of the bad things. But one of the things I tell my leadership is my job is to manage scarcity, right? I have a finite number of resources to deal with a risk and threat spectrum that far exceeds my resources. And we have to spend our time and our resources where it makes the most sense. And that's the same thing the business is doing. And your COVID example is perfect. Any CISO that denied the possibility of moving to a remote work option is no longer in that role because that is how the business was going to exist. It was an existential risk. And if anyone thought cyber, was going to supersede an existential risk, they're sorely
Absolutely
mistaken.
Yeah. I mean, we looked at a bunch of security controls and we said, which of these can we remove? Because the friction that they introduce is not worth it's not worth the security benefit and the risk mitigation value of them. So for instance, prior to COVID, we had remote work by exception. So you actually had to request remote access to VPN and 2FA to be able to get it. By default, it wasn't allowed, which as a security person made me feel great. But as a risk person, I said, this is stupid. Like, why would we make everyone submit a request, everyone in the company submit a request saying they need access? This should just be a default access that everyone has going forward. It's a birthright, part of the birthright role. And that's what we did. Same thing with access reviews. We had access reviews coming up, I think, the second month after the world shut down. And we said, really, are we going to make people go do access reviews when they're just getting home and worried about their kids and worried about everything and all this stuff? And how do we get hospitals up and ready? And how do we do it in the parking lots? This is really stupid. This is just going to be a robo exercise. There's no benefit of doing an access review. So we just skipped the access review too. Now, the security compliance person in me is like, are you sure? This feels like a really dumb thing to do. The risk person in me is like, absolutely, this is a no-brainer.
Absolutely. When we return to office and things change, then you revisit all of those decisions that you made during COVID, and you change with the business. As the business evolves, you evolve. We talk about the evolving threat landscape. That's a perfect example of an evolving threat landscape. Well, Omar, thank you for your time. This was an amazing, enlightening conversation. I wanted to talk about how we align with the business, and we actually got into some other topics as well. So thank you. I appreciate your candor, and I know everyone that listened was better because of it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. My pleasure. I am so glad to have had the opportunity to have this conversation. It's something I'm passionate about. Is how can we set up security organizations and security leaders for success? And sometimes I feel like we are working way harder than we need to when there's simpler ways of doing it. It took me a long time and many mistakes to figure that out.
Well, hopefully others will see in plain sight some of those lessons you had to learn in hindsight.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. I love it. Thanks, Jerich.